"You'll never touch my money again," Charles said smugly, leaning back in his leather chair like a man who just won the lottery of divorce. The air in courtroom 7B hung thick with expensive cologne and impending cruelty. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get to the story. Florence Henderson sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, 67 years old, pearl earrings catching the fluorescent light, navy dress pressed to perfection. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman who'd already surrendered. A relic. A footnote in someone else's success story. Across the polished oak divide, Charles clasped Melissa Grant's manicured hand, his thumb stroking her wrist in lazy circles. His mother, Eleanor, perched beside them like a vulture in Chanel, her thin lips curved in a smile that had been 40 years in the making. They formed a tableau of victory, three people who'd already divided the spoils before the judge had even spoken. Melissa leaned close to Charles, her whisper carrying just enough for Florence to hear. "Sweetheart, she doesn't deserve a cent." Eleanor's voice joined the chorus, smooth as poison. "Let her learn what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you." Florence didn't flinch. Didn't turn her head. Her hands remained folded in her lap, fingers interlaced with the practiced stillness of a woman who'd spent 40 years perfecting the art of disappearing while still being present. The massive diamond on her left hand, Charles's grandmother's ring, the one he'd made such a show of giving her, caught the light. She hadn't removed it yet. Not because she still loved him, but because she wanted him to see it one last time before everything changed. The judge, a stern man named Patterson who'd seen countless divorces dissolve into theatrical warfare, cleared his throat. He looked weary, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed but his eyes carrying the weight of too many broken families. He flipped through the folder Florence's attorney had submitted. Thin. Almost embarrassingly sparse compared to the 3-inch binder Charles's legal team had presented, complete with color-coded tabs and printed exhibits. Charles's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Bronson, had spent the last 20 minutes painting Florence as a financial dependent, a woman who'd contributed nothing to the marriage except domestic labor that Mr. Henderson generously compensated through housing, clothing, and lifestyle maintenance. The words still hung in the air like smoke. Generously compensated. As if 40 years of marriage, of building a home, of raising 2 children, of being the foundation beneath Charles's carefully constructed empire, could be reduced to a charitable donation. Judge Patterson's bushy eyebrows knitted together as he reached the end of Florence's submission. Then his hand stopped. His eyes landed on something unusual, a sealed envelope, cream-colored and modest, tucked into the back sleeve of the folder. It looked almost out of place, too personal, too simple among the legal documents and financial statements. "Mrs. Henderson," Judge Patterson said, his curiosity evident in the slight tilt of his head, "is this the letter you wanted me to read?" The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Florence's voice emerged quiet but crystalline, the same voice that had once commanded classrooms full of restless teenagers, the same voice that had read bedtime stories to her children, the same voice Charles had spent 4 decades trying to silence. "Yes, Your Honor. Everything you need is in there." Charles shifted in his seat, unconcerned. Melissa suppressed a smirk. Eleanor examined her manicure with practiced boredom. They'd been assured by Bronson that Florence had no ammunition, no separate accounts, no hidden assets, no evidence of anything except a long marriage to a successful man who'd finally decided to upgrade. The courtroom stilled. Even the court reporter's fingers paused above her machine, sensing something shifting in the atmosphere like the pressure change before a storm. Judge Patterson slid his letter opener beneath the seal. The sound of tearing paper seemed to echo in the silence. He unfolded the pages. There appeared to be several, handwritten in neat, teacher-perfect script. His eyes began to move across the first page, once, quickly. Then he stopped. Went back to the beginning. Started reading again, this time more slowly. His expression shifted like weather, confusion first, the slight frown of a man trying to process unexpected information. Then recognition, his eyebrows rising slightly as pieces fell into place. Then something Florence hadn't seen directed at her in decades. Genuine surprise. His lips twitched. Once. Twice. A low chuckle escaped, quickly stifled. He covered his mouth with his hand, tried to compose himself, but another laugh broke through. Then another. Within seconds, deep, unrestrained laughter filled the courtroom, the kind that made his shoulders shake and his glasses slip down his nose. Charles's hand went rigid in Melissa's grasp. The color drained slightly from his face, though he tried to maintain his confident expression. Melissa's perfect smile wavered, uncertainty flickering across her features. Eleanor's smile froze mid-breath, her eyes narrowing as she leaned forward slightly, trying to see what the judge was reading. Bronson stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I must object to." Judge Patterson held up one hand, still reading, still occasionally chuckling. "Sit down, Mr. Bronson. Trust me, you'll want to hear this." He turned the page. "Read more." Shook his head in what looked like disbelief mixed with admiration. He pulled off his glasses, wiped the corners of his eyes with his thumb and forefinger, then settled the frames back on his nose and looked up. First at Charles, whose expression had gone from smug confidence to barely concealed anxiety. Then at Florence, who sat exactly as she had before, calm, composed, hands folded. But now, something had changed in her eyes. A glimmer of steel that had always been there, just buried beneath 40 years of being told she was too soft, too trusting, too simple to understand the complexities of money and power. Judge Patterson's voice carried both amusement and something harder when he finally spoke. "Oh," he said, removing his glasses again to wipe them with a handkerchief he pulled from his robe, "this. Mrs. Henderson, this is extraordinary." "Your Honor," Bronson tried again, "I really must." "Mr. Bronson," the judge interrupted, his tone now completely shifted from amused to razor-sharp professional, "does your client have offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands? Specifically, accounts numbered 4472 to 8891 and 4472 to 8903? The courtroom went dead silent. Charles's face went white. Actually white, the color draining so quickly that for a moment Florence wondered if he might faint. I don't. What accounts?" "Your Honor, I have no idea what." "Don't." Judge Patterson's voice cut through the stammering like a blade. "Don't insult my intelligence by playing ignorant. Your wife's letter reads like a forensic accountant's dream." He flipped to another page. "It seems you've been quite busy. Shell corporations. Falsified tax documents. Client funds redirected through companies registered in, let me see, yes, in Ms. Grant's name." Melissa's hand slipped from Charles's arm as if she'd been burned. "I didn't, Charles, what is he talking about?" Eleanor's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her carefully maintained composure cracking like porcelain. Judge Patterson continued reading, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone listing evidence. "Bank transfers on these dates. Wire receipts. Forged signatures, quite a few of them, apparently using Mrs. Henderson's identity without her knowledge or consent." He looked directly at Charles. "And my personal favorite, the lake house purchased 20 years ago in Mrs. Henderson's name, then quietly transferred out of it 6 months ago through a notarized document she never actually signed." Bronson was on his feet again. "Your Honor, these are serious allegations that require proper investigation. I request an immediate recess so my client can." "Oh, you'll get your recess, Mr. Bronson," Judge Patterson said. "Right after I finish reading this remarkable document." He turned back to the letter, his finger tracing down the page. "Mrs. Henderson has been quite thorough. Account numbers. Transfer dates. Amounts. Names of clients whose funds were redirected. She's even included copies of bank statements, photographs of documents, and," he paused, that surprised laugh escaping again, "transcripts of phone conversations between your client and Ms. Grant discussing how to hide assets before filing for divorce." Charles looked like he might be sick. Melissa had pushed her chair back, creating distance. Eleanor sat frozen, her face a mask of horror as the full scope of what was happening began to sink in. Florence remained perfectly still. Her heartbeat was steady. Her breathing even. She'd spent 3 months preparing for this moment, 3 months of late nights in her study, carefully documenting every transaction, every lie, every piece of evidence that Charles had been careless enough to leave lying around because he'd assumed she was too simple to understand what she was looking at. He'd made the same mistake he'd made for 40 years, he'd underestimated her. Judge Patterson set down the letter, but kept his hand on it as if it were precious. He looked at Florence with something that might have been respect. "Mrs. Henderson, did you compile this research yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice remained soft, but there was steel underneath now. "I had some help verifying certain technical details from a former student who works in financial crimes investigation, but the initial research was mine. I'm quite good with details. It's what made me a successful principal, paying attention to the things most people overlook." "I can see that." Judge Patterson turned to Charles's table. "Mr. Henderson, I'm going to ask you a question, and I strongly suggest you consult with your attorney before answering. Are you aware that your activities, as documented in this letter, constitute multiple felonies including embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud?" Bronson grabbed Charles's arm before he could speak. "Your Honor, we request an immediate recess. My client will not be answering any questions at this time." "Granted." Judge Patterson nodded toward the bailiff. "But before we adjourn, I'm going to make a phone call to the district attorney's office. They're going to be very interested in this letter." He looked at Charles again, and there was no humor left in his expression. "Very interested indeed." The bailiff stepped forward. Eleanor stood on shaking legs, grabbing her purse. Melissa was already halfway to the door, her designer heels clicking frantically against the tile floor. Charles turned to look at Florence, and for the first time in their entire marriage, she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear. Not of losing the divorce. Not of losing his money. Fear of losing everything. Florence met his gaze steadily. She didn't smile. Didn't gloat. She simply held his stare with the calm certainty of someone who'd played the long game and won. And then, only then, as the courtroom began to empty and chaos swirled around them, Florence Henderson allowed herself to smile. Not a polite smile. Not an accommodating one. Not the smile of a woman trying to keep the peace or smooth over tension. A smile that knew exactly what came next. A smile that said, "You told me I'd never touch your money again, Charles. You were right. But I can do something so much better than that. I can make sure you never touch it again either." Judge Patterson gathered the letter carefully, treating it like the evidence it was. As he stood to leave, he paused and looked back at Florence. "Mrs. Henderson," he said quietly, "in 30 years on this bench, I've seen a lot of people seek revenge. But I've rarely seen anyone seek justice quite this elegantly." "Thank you, Your Honor," Florence said. "I prefer to think of it as a final exam. And after 40 years of study, I made sure to get every answer right." The divorce hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday in late September, when the afternoon light slanted through the courtroom windows at an angle that made everything look slightly golden and unreal. Florence Henderson arrived 15 minutes early. She always arrived early. 40 years of teaching had trained punctuality into her bones, that and the fear of disappointing people, of being found lacking, of giving anyone a reason to call her irresponsible or scattered or any of the other words Charles had used when she dared to run 5 minutes behind schedule. Old habits, she'd learned, died harder than love. She sat at the plaintiff's table in courtroom 7B, hands folded in her lap, wearing a navy dress that had cost her 3 months of careful saving from the household allowance Charles had generously provided. Her late mother's pearls rested against her collarbone, real ones, from a time when her family had money, before her father's business collapsed and before she'd learned that financial security could be a cage as easily as a comfort. At 67, Florence knew she looked older than her years. Stress aged you in ways that expensive creams couldn't fix. But she sat with perfect posture, chin lifted, silver hair swept into a soft twist that had taken her 3 tries to get right that morning. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained even. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman who'd already accepted defeat. That was exactly what she wanted them to think. Across the aisle, Charles Henderson held court like a king who'd never doubted his throne. At 70, he remained handsome in that particular way some men achieved, the kind of attractiveness built on confidence and privilege rather than actual symmetry of features. His gray hair was professionally styled. His suit was bespoke. He wore success like cologne, and he'd made sure everyone in the room could smell it. Beside him sat Melissa Grant. Florence had seen pictures, of course. Had known about her for 8 months before she'd let Charles know she knew. But seeing Melissa in person was different. She was younger than Florence had imagined, 34, maybe 35, with highlighted blonde hair that fell in expensive waves and a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Florence's entire wardrobe. She wore the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. From never having to wonder if she deserved the things she took. Melissa's hand rested on Charles's arm, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Florence recognized that bracelet. She'd seen the charge on their joint credit card 3 months ago, the one Charles hadn't bothered to hide because he assumed Florence never looked at the statements. Because she was too scatterbrained for finances, as he'd said so many times it had become truth through repetition. $15,000 for a bracelet. While Florence had been told they needed to be conservative about her request for a new winter coat. In the front row, directly behind Charles, sat Eleanor Henderson, Charles's mother, a woman who'd spent 75 years perfecting the art of cutting people down with a smile. She wore St. John knit and judgment in equal measure, her thin frame radiating disapproval like heat from a radiator. Eleanor had never liked Florence. Had never thought a schoolteacher from a family with unfortunate financial troubles was good enough for her son. She'd made that clear from the engagement onward, in 1,000 tiny cuts disguised as helpful advice. "Dear, are you sure you want to serve that at dinner? Charles is used to more refined cuisine. Darling, perhaps a smaller piece of cake. We don't want Charles to think you've let yourself go. Florence, sweetheart, maybe you should let Charles handle the important decisions. You know how overwhelmed you get." 40 years of poison, delivered with a smile and the expectation of gratitude. Now, Eleanor sat behind her son like a general watching a battle she'd already won, her lips curved in satisfaction. She'd helped orchestrate this moment, Florence knew that now. Had known it since she'd found the emails between Charles and his mother, discussing the Florence problem, and how best to minimize her claim on family assets. They'd thought they were so clever. They'd thought she'd never look. The courtroom filled slowly. Charles's attorney, Robert Bronson, sharp-featured, sharp-suited, sharp in every way except morals, arrived with a leather briefcase and a 3-inch binder of evidence. Florence's attorney, David Ruiz, carried only a thin folder and the quiet confidence of someone who knew something everyone else didn't. David had been Florence's student 20 years ago, a kid from the wrong side of town who'd been told he'd never amount to anything. She'd spent a year staying after school with him, helping him bring his grades up, writing letters of recommendation, making phone calls on his behalf. Now he worked for the Financial Crimes Bureau and specialized in white-collar crime. When Florence had called him 3 months ago, voice shaking, asking if they could meet somewhere private, he'd cleared his schedule immediately. "Mrs. Henderson," he'd said when she showed him the first documents, "I think you might be sitting on something bigger than a divorce case." At 2 p.m. exactly, Judge Patterson entered, a stern-faced man with a salt-and-pepper beard and eyes that had seen too many marriages crumble into petty warfare. He looked tired before he even sat down. "Please be seated," the bailiff intoned. The hearing began with procedural formalities. Then Bronson stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced precision. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who charged $800 an hour, "this is a straightforward case of dissolution of marriage. My client, Mr. Charles Henderson, has been the sole financial provider throughout a 40-year marriage. Mrs. Henderson, while certainly a dedicated homemaker, has contributed no income and has no separate assets. Mr. Henderson is prepared to offer a generous settlement." "Generous," Charles echoed, as if the word itself proved his nobility. Melissa squeezed his hand, her voice a staged whisper that carried perfectly across the silent courtroom. "Sweetheart, she doesn't deserve a cent." Eleanor leaned forward, adding her venom to the mix with that same sweet poison tone Florence had endured for decades. Let her learn what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Florence didn't react. Didn't turn her head. Her hands remained folded, her expression serene. Inside, her heart beat steady and calm, the rhythm of someone who'd spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Judge Patterson sighed, the sound of a man who'd heard this story too many times. He reached for the folders, first Charles's impressive binder, then Florence's embarrassingly thin submission. He flipped through Charles's evidence with mechanical efficiency. Financial statements showing his income. Property deeds in his name. Investment accounts listing him as sole owner. Everything documented with the kind of thoroughness that suggested Charles had been planning this divorce for years. Which, Florence knew, he had been. Then Judge Patterson reached Florence's folder. 2 pages of basic information. A brief history of the marriage. And tucked in the back, almost as an afterthought, a sealed envelope. Cream-colored. Modest. The kind of stationery Florence used to write thank you notes and condolence cards. Judge Patterson's weathered fingers paused on it. His eyebrows knitted together in curiosity. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, looking up at her for the first time with something other than professional detachment, "is this the letter you wanted me to read?" The courtroom held its breath. Florence met his eyes. When she spoke, her voice emerged quiet but crystalline, the same voice that had once commanded classrooms, read bedtime stories, and spent 40 years saying, "Yes, dear," when she meant, "You're wrong." "Yes, Your Honor. Everything you need is in there." Charles shifted in his seat, barely suppressing a smirk. Melissa examined her manicure. Eleanor's expression radiated bored certainty. This was already over, and everyone knew it. Everyone except the woman they'd underestimated. Judge Patterson slid his letter opener beneath the seal. The sound of tearing paper seemed unnaturally loud. He unfolded several pages, handwritten, Florence's neat teacher script filling both sides. He began to read. His expression shifted like clouds before a storm, confusion first, then something sharper. His eyebrows rose. His lips pressed together. Then, impossibly, they twitched upward. A sound escaped him. Low. Quickly stifled. A chuckle. He tried to compose himself, cleared his throat, but then his eyes hit another line and another laugh broke through. Within seconds, deep, genuine laughter filled the courtroom, the kind that made his shoulders shake and his glasses slip down his nose. Charles's hand went rigid. The smirk evaporated from his face. Melissa's confident posture wavered. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression cracking. Judge Patterson wiped his eyes, still reading, still occasionally chuckling. He looked up, first at Charles, whose face had gone pale, then at Florence, who sat exactly as she had before. Calm. Composed. Unbreakable. "Oh," Judge Patterson said finally, his voice carrying both amusement and something harder, something that made Bronson half rise from his seat in alarm. "This. Mrs. Henderson, this is good." And for the first time in 40 years, in a marriage built on control, humiliation, and carefully constructed dependence, Florence Henderson allowed the corners of her mouth to curve upward. Not a smile of politeness. Not accommodation or appeasement. A smile of absolute certainty. The smile of a woman who'd done her homework. And was about to teach her final, devastating lesson. 40 years earlier. Florence Miller met Charles Henderson at a faculty mixer she almost didn't attend. She was 27, teaching English literature at Jefferson High School, and perfectly content with her small apartment, her stack of ungraded essays, and her Friday nights spent reading Virginia Woolf with a glass of cheap wine. She'd gone to the mixer only because her colleague Margaret had insisted, practically dragging her out of the teacher's lounge with promises that, "You can't spend every weekend alone with dead authors, Flo." Charles had been there representing his father's investment firm, schmoozing with the superintendent, making connections, working the room with the easy charm of someone who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. He was 30, handsome in his tailored suit, and when he'd spotted Florence standing awkwardly by the refreshment table, He'd crossed the room with the confidence of a man who always got what he wanted. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he'd said, handing her a glass of wine she hadn't asked for. "I'm a terrible liar, apparently," Florence had replied. He'd laughed, a warm, genuine sound that made her feel clever instead of awkward. "I like honest women. They're rare in my world." 6 months later, he proposed with his grandmother's ring and promises of a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. Florence, whose own father had gambled away the family hardware store and left her mother scrambling to survive, had been seduced by Charles's stability as much as his charm. "I'll take care of everything," he'd promised. "You'll never have to worry about money again." At the time, it had sounded like love. The first shift happened so subtly that Florence didn't notice it as a shift at all. 3 months into their marriage, Charles sat her down at the kitchen table of their new house, a modest colonial he'd purchased with a down payment she never saw the paperwork for, and spread out a series of documents. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone reasonable, almost paternal. "It makes sense for me to handle all the finances. My background is in investment and wealth management. You're brilliant with literature and teaching, but numbers." He'd smiled, squeezed her hand. "Well, you've said yourself you're not great with math." Florence had said that once, joking about balancing her checkbook. But now it was presented as fact, as fundamental truth about her capabilities. "I trust you," she'd said, because she did. Because marriage was supposed to be about trust. "Good." He'd slid a paper toward her. "Just sign here. I'm consolidating our accounts, it'll make everything simpler. One checking account, one savings account, everything in both our names." She'd signed. Why wouldn't she? What she didn't realize until years later was that both our names meant Charles's name first, with his signature required for any transaction over $100. Her name was there, technically present, but functionally powerless. The receipt started shortly after. When Charles bought her a new dress for a faculty dinner, he'd present it with a flourish, "Only the best for my beautiful wife," but later, she'd find the receipt carefully filed in his office. Not thrown away. Filed. As if he were documenting every kindness, every gift, creating a ledger of her indebtedness. When she mentioned wanting to buy a new set of books for her classroom, he'd sigh. "Sweetheart, we need to be careful with money. Let me see if we can fit it into next month's budget." Their money became his budget. Her salary, deposited directly into their joint account, became invisible, absorbed into the larger narrative of Charles as provider and Florence as dependent. "Flo, you wouldn't understand," became his favorite phrase. Said with a smile, with affection even, but always with the underlying message, "You're not capable." When their daughter Emma was born, followed 2 years later by their son Thomas, Florence's world contracted further. She took a year off teaching, then another, until Charles suggested, gently, lovingly, that maybe she should focus on being a full-time mother. "The kids need you," he said. "And honestly, with my promotions, we don't need your income. Why stress yourself?" She'd returned to teaching eventually, but part-time now, her identity shifting from professional to accessory. The house expanded, a bigger colonial, then a tutor in the historic district, but her personal space shrank. Her study became a guest room. Her bookshelves were moved to the basement to make room for Charles's golf trophies. Even her pension, the retirement account she'd been contributing to since her first teaching job, disappeared into Charles's consolidated investment strategy. "Trust me," he'd said. "I can get you better returns than the state pension fund. I'm moving it into a portfolio that'll set us both up for retirement." She'd signed the papers because he'd made her feel foolish for questioning him. Because financial literacy, she'd been told so many times, wasn't her strength. By the time she was 55, Florence Henderson had become a woman who asked permission to buy groceries, who apologized for spending too much on birthday gifts for her grandchildren, who believed, genuinely believed, that she was bad with money because everyone in her life had told her so. Charles had built her cage with compliments and kindness, with "I'm protecting you," and "I know what's best for us." And she'd helped him turn the key. The cracks appeared slowly at first, like hairline fractures in porcelain. Charles started working late. Not occasionally, constantly. 3 nights a week became 4, then 5. He'd come home smelling of expensive restaurants Florence was never invited to, of wine she never shared, of perfume that wasn't hers. Client dinners, he'd explain, kissing her forehead with the distracted affection one might give a family dog. Boring stuff. You wouldn't enjoy it. His phone habits changed. Suddenly it was password protected. Suddenly he took calls in his office with the door closed, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur Florence could hear but not decipher through the heavy oak. Late one night, she'd heard laughter, Charles's laughter, rich and genuine in a way she hadn't heard directed at her in years. She'd stood outside his office door, hand raised to knock, and heard him say, "I can't wait to see you either." When he'd emerged 20 minutes later, he'd seemed surprised to find her still awake. "Can't sleep?" he'd asked. "Who was that on the phone?" "Client." The answer came too quickly, too smooth. "Asian markets. Different time zone." Florence had wanted to believe him. Had needed to believe him. Because the alternative, that after 40 years of shrinking herself, of becoming smaller and smaller to fit into his vision of the perfect wife, the alternative was that she'd sacrificed everything for a man who'd stopped seeing her years ago. She'd started noticing other things. The way he'd added a gym membership but never came home with gym bags. The business trips that appeared on the calendar with no details. The credit card statement that showed charges at jewelry stores she'd never received gifts from. One Tuesday afternoon, while Charles was supposedly meeting with estate planners, Florence had been looking for her reading glasses and found his tablet on the kitchen counter. It wasn't locked, a rare oversight that felt like fate. She'd meant to just check the time. Instead, she'd seen the message notification. "Melissa Grant, don't forget our weekend at the lake house. I've already wired the decorator. Can't wait to see what she does with our space." 2 hearts. Our space. The lake house. Florence's hands had started shaking. The lake house, the one Charles had purchased 20 years ago as an investment in our future retirement. The place where she'd imagined spending quiet mornings reading on the porch, watching the water change with the seasons. The place that was supposed to be in her name. Was supposed to be. She'd set down the tablet carefully, as if it might explode. Then she'd walk to Charles's office, to the filing cabinet where he kept all the important documents she was too scatterbrained to manage. The lake house deed was in the second drawer, in a folder labeled Real Estate Holdings. Only her name wasn't on it. She'd checked the original deed from 20 years ago. There it was, clear as day, Florence Marie Henderson. Sole owner, per Charles's insistence that it be her retirement gift. Then she'd found the quitclaim deed, dated 6 months earlier. Her signature at the bottom, except it wasn't her signature. Close, but the loops were wrong. The pressure too even. Forged. Charles had transferred her property out of her name. To himself. Then, based on another document she found, into a trust. A trust that listed Melissa Grant as beneficiary. He'd stolen her retirement home. Her dream. And given it to his mistress. The decorator Melissa had mentioned? She was probably erasing every trace of Florence from a house that had never legally belonged to her in the first place. Florence had driven to the lake house that evening. 2 hours north, winding roads through forests that blurred through her tears. She'd let herself in with the key she'd carried on her keychain for 20 years, surprised when it still worked, though she supposed Charles hadn't thought to change the locks yet. Why would he? She never came here without him. She'd been trained not to make decisions like that independently. The house was different. All her furniture, the pieces she'd carefully chosen, the antiques she'd refinished herself, gone. Replaced with modern, minimalist pieces that screamed expensive and soulless. Her grandmother's quilt, removed. The watercolor painting she'd bought at a local artist's studio, vanished. In the bedroom, their bedroom, except it wasn't anymore, she'd found evidence of the redecoration. Paint samples. Fabric swatches. A notebook with Melissa's handwriting, master sweet ideas. Florence had stood in the doorway of the house that should have been hers, holding the forged deed in trembling hands, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not her heart breaking. That had broken quietly over years of small cuts. This was something else. This was rage. Pure, cold, clarifying rage. For 40 years, she'd made herself smaller. Had let Charles convince her she was incapable, impractical, too soft-hearted for the harsh realities of money and power. For 40 years, she'd believed him. But standing in that gutted lake house, Florence remembered something she'd forgotten. She hadn't become a school principal by being soft. She'd become a principal by being observant, strategic, and meticulous. She'd managed budgets, resolved conflicts, and documented everything because in education, documentation was survival. Charles had spent decades training her to be helpless. But he'd forgotten she'd spent those same decades teaching. And teachers knew how to grade papers. How to spot plagiarism. How to catch cheaters. How to build an airtight case. Florence had whispered into the empty house, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. You took everything, Charles. Every dollar, every choice, every piece of myself I gave you freely. You took it and made me believe I never deserved it in the first place. She'd folded the forged deed carefully, slipped it into her purse alongside the other documents she'd photographed earlier. Then she'd smiled, not a happy smile, but the smile of a teacher who'd just caught a student cheating and was about to deliver a very educational lesson about consequences. Let's see what happens, she'd said to the empty room, to the ghost of the woman she used to be, to the future she was about to create, when the teacher gives the final test. Florence became a ghost in her own home. Not literally, she still made breakfast, still kept the house running with the quiet efficiency Charles had come to expect and ignore. But internally, she'd slipped into a kind of invisibility that allowed her to observe without being observed, to move through spaces where secrets lived. Charles had spent 40 years training her to be unseen. Now she'd make that her greatest weapon. The morning after her visit to the lake house, Florence had woken at 5:30 a.m., her usual time, and lain in bed beside her sleeping husband, studying his face in the dim light. He looked peaceful. Innocent, almost. The face of a man whose conscience never troubled his sleep. She'd felt a strange detachment wash over her, as if she were looking at a stranger. This man who'd shared her bed for 4 decades, who'd fathered her children, who'd systematically erased her from her own life, he was a puzzle now. A problem to be solved with the same methodical patience she'd once applied to difficult students. The ones who thought they were too clever to get caught. She'd risen quietly, made coffee, and begun her new routine. Charles's office was supposed to be off limits, my space for concentration, he declared years ago, but he'd never actually locked the door. Why would he? Florence was too intimidated by financial matters to snoop. Too trusting to question. Too well-trained to disobey. Or so he believed. That first morning, while Charles showered and dressed for work, Florence had slipped into his office with a notepad and her phone. She'd started with the filing cabinet, photographing documents quickly, methodically. Tax returns. Investment statements. Corporate filings for Henderson and Associates Financial Services. What she'd found in those first hours made her hands shake so badly she'd had to stop and breathe deeply, grounding herself the way she'd once taught anxious students before exams. Client accounts showed deposits that didn't match the withdrawal records. Money flowing in, then disappearing into transfers labeled administrative fees and portfolio adjustments. Except the amounts were staggering, 30,000 here, 50,000 there. Hundreds of transactions that seemed designed to be too small to trigger suspicion individually but added up to millions collectively. And the transfers led to accounts she didn't recognize. Corporate names that sounded legitimate, Cyprus Financial Holdings, Meridian Investment Trust, but when she'd searched them online during her lunch break at school, she'd found nothing. No websites. No business registrations. No existence beyond the paperwork in Charles's files. Shell companies. Florence didn't have a degree in finance, but she'd graded enough research papers to recognize a pattern. These weren't legitimate business entities. They were places to hide money. Her realization had arrived with cold, devastating clarity. Charles wasn't just cheating on her. He was stealing from his clients. She'd moved through the house like an archaeologist after that, excavating layers of deception. The recycling bin yielded crumpled bank statements Charles had meant to shred. The coat closet contained a box of old files he'd forgotten to destroy. Even his bedside table drawer held a burner phone, the kind people bought to hide communications they didn't want traced. Florence had powered it on with shaking fingers, half expecting it to be password protected. But Charles's arrogance had made him sloppy. The phone opened directly to a text thread with a contact saved only as M. Melissa. Months of messages. Some mundane, running late, order without me, others intimate in ways that made Florence's stomach turn. But scattered among the flirtation and planning were references to money. To transfers completing by Friday, and the Cayman account is active, and your mother was right, she'll never notice. Your mother was right. Eleanor. Florence had suspected Charles's mother was involved, but confirmation arrived that Thursday evening when she'd been in the kitchen preparing dinner, chicken piccata, Charles's favorite, a recipe she'd perfected over the years to his exact specifications. Eleanor had arrived unannounced, as she often did, letting herself in with the key Charles had given her despite Florence's gentle protests years ago. Florence had heard her voice from the foyer, calling out for Charles, then the sound of his office door closing. Florence had turned down the heat on the stovetop. Moved quietly to the hallway. Positioned herself near the office door where a heating vent carried sound from inside with surprising clarity. Too risky, Charles was saying. If she starts asking questions. She won't. Eleanor's voice, sharp and certain. Charles, darling, you're overthinking this. Florence is too old to fight back. Too conditioned. Just keep her confused and compliant like you always have. But the divorce will go exactly as we planned. Your attorney already has everything positioned. She'll walk away with the bare minimum, and that little accountant of yours gets the lake house. Everyone wins. Except Florence. There was a pause. Then Eleanor had laughed, a cold, brittle sound. Florence stopped being a consideration years ago. She's served her purpose. Now she's just, overhead to be eliminated. Overhead to be eliminated. Florence had stood frozen in the hallway, one hand pressed against the wall for balance. Her mother-in-law, the woman she'd endured Sunday dinners with for 40 years, whose criticism she'd absorbed with grace, whose approval she'd desperately sought, had just reduced her to a line item on a balance sheet. She'd returned to the kitchen on autopilot, finishing the chicken piccata with mechanical precision. When Eleanor had emerged 20 minutes later, Florence had smiled and offered her a plate. No thank you, dear, Eleanor had said, patting Florence's cheek with the condescension one might show a simple-minded child. I'm meeting friends for dinner. Real food, you understand. The casual cruelty should have hurt. A week ago, it would have. But Florence had moved past hurt into something colder and more useful. Calculation. She'd contacted David Ruiz the next morning, using the personal cell number he'd written on his business card years ago after a chance encounter at the grocery store. Mrs. Henderson. His voice had carried surprise and warmth. This is unexpected. How are you? I need help, David. And I think what I'm dealing with might fall under your jurisdiction. They'd met at a coffee shop 40 minutes outside of town, far from anywhere Charles or his associates might frequent. David had arrived in jeans and a sweater, off-duty casual, but his expression had shifted to professional concern the moment Florence began spreading documents across their corner table. He'd studied them in silence, his jaw tightening as he flipped through pages. Tax returns with inconsistent deductions. Transfer records showing money moving between accounts in patterns that seemed designed to obscure their origin. Corporate filings for businesses that didn't exist. Mrs. Henderson, he'd said finally, looking up at her with something between shock and admiration, how long have you been collecting this? 5, he'd blinked. You found all of this in 5 days? When you spend 40 years being told you're not smart enough to understand finances, people get careless about hiding things from you. Florence had taken a sip of her coffee, surprised by how steady her hands had become. They assume you'll never look. Never question. Never connect the dots. But you did. I'm a teacher, David. Pattern recognition is what I do. And Charles. She'd smiled thinly. Charles has very clear patterns once you start looking. David had spread the documents out, arranging them into groups with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd built cases before. This is serious. We're talking about potential wire fraud, money laundering, embezzlement. If these shell companies are what I think they are, your husband could be facing federal charges. Good. The word had emerged flat and cold. David had looked at her with new understanding. You want to destroy him. I want justice, Florence had corrected. There's a difference. Destruction would be emotional. Revenge for revenge's sake. Justice is strategic. It's about making sure he faces consequences for what he's actually done, to his clients, to me, to everyone who trusted him. David had leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same careful attention she remembered from his student days. You've changed. No, Florence had said quietly. I've just remembered who I was before I let someone else define me. Over the following weeks, Florence and David had met 4 more times, always discreetly, always far from prying eyes. David had walked her through the process of building a proper case, what evidence would hold up in court, what needed additional documentation, how to establish clear chains of financial transactions. Florence had become meticulous in ways that would have made her younger self proud. She'd purchased a leather-bound journal, small enough to hide but substantial enough to feel official, and titled the first page in her neat teacher's script. For the record. Inside, she'd documented everything. Dates and times of suspicious phone calls. Amounts transferred and account numbers. Names of clients whose statements showed discrepancies. Photographs of documents cross-referenced with page numbers and locations. She'd even started recording conversations, carefully, legally, using the voice memo function on her phone when Charles would explain why she couldn't access certain accounts or why her questions about their finances were unnecessary stress. Flo, sweetheart, you're getting worked up over nothing, he'd said during one such conversation, his tone dripping with patronizing affection. The accounts are fine. I've consolidated some investments, that's all. You know how these things work. Actually, I don't, she'd replied, her voice carefully maintaining the helpless tone he expected. Could you explain it to me? I'd like to understand. Maybe later. I'm late for a meeting. The recording had captured everything, his dismissiveness, his refusal to explain, his assumption that she'd simply accept whatever he told her. It was beautiful evidence. One evening, 3 months into her investigation, Florence had been sitting in her small study, the room Charles had finally conceded she could have after she'd quietly insisted, when she'd come across their wedding photo. It had been tucked into a box of old mementos, covered in dust. She'd lifted it carefully, studying the young woman in the white dress. 27 years old, smiling with genuine happiness, her hand in Charles's, believing in partnership and mutual respect and all the promises he'd made. That woman looked like a stranger now. Florence had carried the photograph downstairs to the kitchen. Had placed it in the sink. Had struck a match and watched the corner catch fire, the flames consuming the image slowly, first her dress, then Charles's face, then both of them dissolving into ash. She'd whispered into the quiet kitchen, her voice steady and certain. You taught me control, Charles. You spent 40 years making me smaller, more compliant, more dependent. Teaching me that I couldn't trust my own judgment. The photograph had curled and blackened, smoke rising toward the ceiling. But I learned something else. I learned precision. I learned patience. I learned that the best revenge isn't emotional, it's methodical. The last piece of the photograph had crumbled into ash. Florence had rinsed it down the drain, washed her hands, and returned to her study. To her journal. To her evidence. To the case she was building with the care and attention she'd once devoted to being the perfect wife. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone new. Someone who understood that the best way to fight power wasn't with anger, but with information. Someone who was about to teach Charles Henderson the most important lesson of his life. Never underestimate the woman you've spent years teaching to be invisible. Because invisible people see everything. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic as he handed Florence the manila envelope. She'd been expecting them. Had known they were coming for weeks, ever since she'd overheard Charles on the phone with his attorney, discussing timing and optimal positioning. Still, seeing her name typed on legal documents, Henderson versus Henderson, had made something tighten in her chest. Not grief. Not anymore. Anticipation. She'd signed for the envelope, thanked the courier, and carried it to her study. Had opened it carefully, methodically, reading every word with the attention she'd once given to student essays. Charles was claiming irreconcilable differences, that bland legal phrase that meant everything and nothing. But the attached financial disclosures told a different story, one carefully crafted to paint Florence as a woman who'd contributed nothing to the marriage except domestic labor that had been generously compensated through housing, lifestyle maintenance, and spousal support. There was no mention of her teaching salary, deposited faithfully into their joint account for 35 years. No acknowledgement of her pension, which Charles had consolidated into his investment portfolios. No reference to the lake house that had been in her name before he'd forged her signature and transferred it away. According to Charles's filing, Florence Henderson was a dependent. A financial burden. An ungrateful wife who'd enjoyed 40 years of luxury and now wanted more than she deserved. The narrative was clean. Simple. Devastating in its efficiency. And completely fabricated. Florence had set down the papers and pulled out her leather journal, for the record, now filled with 3 months of meticulous documentation. She'd run her fingers over the pages, feeling the weight of every date, every transaction, every piece of evidence she'd collected. Then she'd pulled out a fresh sheet of her personal stationery, cream-colored, simple, the kind she used for thank-you notes, and uncapped her favorite pen. And she'd begun to write. Dear Judge Patterson. By the time you read this letter, you will have reviewed the financial disclosures submitted by my husband, Charles Henderson. They present a particular narrative, one in which I am portrayed as a woman of limited capability and even more limited contribution to our 40-year marriage. I am writing to present a different narrative. One supported not by characterizations, but by documentation. Florence had written for 3 hours straight, her teacher's hand moving across the page with practiced precision. No emotion. No pleading. Just facts, presented in chronological order with the clarity of a woman who'd spent her career teaching students how to build persuasive arguments. She'd outlined the shell companies, Cypress Financial Holdings, Meridian Investment Trust, and 4 others, complete with their registration dates, registered agents, and the pattern of transfers that connected them to Charles's firm. She'd included account numbers for offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, documented with dates and amounts. She detailed the client funds she'd traced, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's retirement account, showing a balance of $450,000 on Charles' statements but only $450,000 on Charles's statements but only $450,000 on Charles' statements but only $280,000 when Florence had discreetly contacted the actual custodial bank. Mr. Robert Chen's trust fund, supposedly worth $600,000, actually registered $600,000, actually reduced to $600,000, actually registered $425,000 with the difference transferred to an account in Melissa Grant's name. Pattern after pattern after pattern. She documented the forged signatures, the quitclaim deed for the lake house, analyzed side by side with her actual signature. The pension transfer forms she'd never signed. The power of attorney documents granting Charles control over assets she hadn't known existed. And she'd saved the most damning evidence for last, the burner phone records, showing text message timestamps that corresponded exactly with wire transfers to offshore accounts. Charles coordinating with Melissa in real time as they moved money that didn't belong to them. Florence had written until her hand cramped, until every piece of evidence had been laid out with the methodical care of someone building an airtight case. Then she'd written her closing paragraph. Judge Patterson, my husband told me, on multiple occasions, that I would never touch his money again. He said this with confidence, believing he'd successfully hidden assets, forged documents, and constructed a financial fortress I was too simple to penetrate. He was correct, in a sense. I won't touch his money again. Because by the time this case concludes, I suspect the government will have frozen every account, seized every asset, and begun the process of returning stolen funds to the clients he defrauded. I may be financially naive, as his attorney suggests. But I am also a woman who spent 40 years teaching students the difference between clever and intelligent. Clever is building elaborate schemes. Intelligent is understanding that everything leaves a trail. My husband was very clever. I hope this letter demonstrates that I am intelligent. Respectfully submitted. Florence Marie Henderson. She'd sealed the letter in a matching cream envelope, written, confidential, for judge's eyes only, across the front, and placed it in her leather portfolio alongside copies of every document she'd referenced. The night before the hearing, Florence had sat in her study long after Charles had gone to bed, listening to him snore in the master bedroom they no longer really shared. She'd pulled out her wedding ring, the one with his grandmother's diamond, the one that had felt like a promise 40 years ago and now felt like a shackle. She'd polished it carefully with jewelry cleaner, watching it sparkle under the desk lamp. Then she'd slipped it off her finger for the first time since Charles had placed it there in 1985. The skin beneath was pale, slightly indented. 40 years of wearing the same ring in the same place had left a mark that wouldn't fade for months. Florence had placed the ring in a small evidence bag, the kind David had given her, and labeled it carefully, wedding ring. Purchased 1985. Appraised value $8,500. Relevant to discussion of marital assets. Everything was evidence now. Everything mattered. That same evening, 40 minutes across town, Charles Henderson poured himself a scotch, the expensive kind, 25-year-old single malt, and settled into the leather chair in his home office. His other home office, the one in the downtown condo he'd purchased 6 months ago in anticipation of his new life. Melissa emerged from the bedroom wearing one of his shirts and nothing else, her hair damp from the shower. She draped herself across his lap with the casual confidence of a woman who'd already won. "Tell me again how much she's getting," Melissa purred, running her fingers through his silver hair. "Bare minimum." Charles took a satisfied sip of scotch. "Bronson assured me. She has no separate assets, no evidence of contribution beyond basic household management. She'll walk away with maybe enough for a small apartment and living expenses. Everything else stays with me." "With us," Melissa corrected, holding up her wrist where a diamond bracelet caught the light. "This is gorgeous, by the way. Early celebration gift?" Charles smiled. The bracelet had cost $15,000, purchased with funds transferred from one of his shell companies, originally belonging to a widow named Patricia Brennan who trusted him to manage her late husband's estate. "You deserve it," he said, kissing Melissa's neck. "You've been patient through all of this. It'll be worth it." Melissa twisted her wrist, admiring how the diamond sparkled. "Once she's out of the picture, we can finally move into the lake house. I cannot wait to host parties there." "Did the decorator finish the master suite?" "Last week. You'll love it." What Charles didn't know, what Melissa didn't know, was that the decorator had also photographed every receipt, every invoice, every piece of evidence showing how Charles had used embezzled client funds to renovate a house he'd stolen from his wife to give to his mistress. The decorator was David Ruiz's sister-in-law. Some coincidences were actually careful planning. Across town, in Eleanor Henderson's pristine Georgian colonial. Eleanor sipped her evening sherry and smiled at the sound of her son's voice on the phone. "Mother, I'm telling you, it's handled. Florence won't know what hit her." "Good." Eleanor examined her manicure, perfect as always. "I told you years ago she was dead weight. A teacher." The word dripped with disdain. "You should have married the Whitfield girl. Old money. Proper breeding." "Well, I'm correcting that mistake now. Better late than never." And you're certain she can't access any of the accounts? Positive. I moved everything months ago. Her name's been stripped from every asset that matters. Her pension's been consolidated into my holdings. Even the lake house, I transferred that out of her name 6 months ago. Eleanor chuckled. Did she even notice? She's too old to fight back, Mother. Too conditioned. She'll accept whatever we give her because that's what she's been trained to do for 40 years. Excellent. Eleanor raised her sherry glass in a private toast. To the end of poor decisions. To new beginnings, Charles echoed. Neither of them knew that Florence had recorded that conversation too, Eleanor's voice clearly audible on the speakerphone Charles had used, every word of conspiracy preserved in crystal-clear audio. For the record. The morning of the hearing. Florence woke at 5 a.m., well before her alarm. She'd slept surprisingly well, the deep, dreamless sleep of someone whose conscience was clear. She showered, dried her hair, and stood before her closet selecting her outfit with the same care a general might choose armor. The navy dress, professional, dignified. Her mother's pearls, a reminder of where she'd come from, a family that valued character over money. Low heels, practical, not performative. She dressed slowly, methodically. Applied minimal makeup. Twisted her silver hair into its customary soft chignon. Then she'd gone to her study one last time, collecting the sealed envelope containing her letter and the thick folder of supporting documentation. David would meet her at the courthouse in an hour to review final strategy, but the real work was already done. Everything that mattered was in that envelope. Florence had stood before the mirror in her bedroom, the same mirror where she'd watched herself shrink over 40 years, becoming smaller and quieter and more invisible with each passing season. But the woman looking back at her now was different. Older, yes. Silver-haired and 67 and carrying the weight of 4 decades. But unbroken. Clear-eyed. Certain. Florence had touched her bare ring finger, still pale, still indented, but getting lighter with each passing day. And she'd whispered to her reflection, her voice soft but utterly steady. Today, you meet the woman you underestimated. Then she'd picked up her leather portfolio, walked out of the house she'd lived in for 30 years, and driven toward the courthouse where her husband waited, confident, arrogant, already celebrating a victory he thought he'd secured. He had no idea he'd just walked into the final exam. And Florence Henderson never curved her grades. Courtroom 7B felt smaller than Florence remembered from her earlier visit with David to familiarize herself with the space. The wooden benches seemed to press inward. The afternoon light slanting through the tall windows created harsh shadows that made everyone look like players in a morality play. Which, Florence supposed, they were. She sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded over her leather portfolio, watching Charles hold court at the defendant's table like a man who'd already won. Melissa sat pressed against his side, her cream-colored suit probably costing more than Florence's monthly pension would have been, if Charles hadn't stolen it. Eleanor occupied the front row like a queen at a coronation, her expression radiating smug satisfaction. The gallery was sparse, a few curious court watchers, a paralegal from Bronson's firm, and in the very back corner, so unobtrusive he might have been invisible, David Ruiz in plain clothes, holding a leather folder that matched Florence's. Just in case. Judge Patterson entered at exactly 2 p.m., and the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Thomas Patterson." The hearing began with procedural efficiency. Bronson stood, buttoning his expensive suit jacket, and launched into his opening statement with the polished confidence of a man who'd won 100 cases just like this one. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward dissolution of marriage. My client, Mr. Charles Henderson, has been the sole financial provider throughout 40 years of marriage. He built a successful investment firm from the ground up, accumulated substantial assets through his own labor and expertise, and generously supported Mrs. Henderson throughout their union." Bronson gestured toward Florence with a patronizing smile. "Mrs. Henderson, while certainly well-meaning, has no financial literacy, no separate income of consequence, and no documented contribution to the marital assets beyond standard domestic duties, which my client compensated through housing, lifestyle maintenance, and what can only be described as extraordinary generosity." Florence kept her expression neutral, but she felt David's eyes on her from the back of the courtroom. They'd prepared for this. Every word of Bronson's statement was expected, choreographed, designed to make her seem like a grateful dependent who should accept whatever scraps Charles deigned to offer. Mr. Henderson is prepared to provide a settlement that, frankly, exceeds what legal precedent would require, Bronson continued. A modest monthly stipend, sufficient for Mrs. Henderson to maintain reasonable accommodations. We believe this more than fair compensation for a woman who, through no fault of her own, simply lacks the capacity to manage complex financial matters. Charles leaned back in his chair, radiating confidence. Melissa squeezed his hand and whispered, just loud enough for Florence to hear across the aisle, "Sweetheart, this is going so well. She really doesn't deserve anything more." Eleanor nodded from the front row, her voice a stage whisper of agreement. Finally, some sense. After all these years of freeloading. Judge Patterson's expression remained unreadable as he made notes. He'd probably heard variations of this argument 1,000 times. Successful husband, dependent wife, dissolution of a marriage that had calcified into financial transaction. "Thank you, Mr. Bronson." The judge turned to Florence's side of the courtroom. "Does Mrs. Henderson's counsel wish to make an opening statement?" David's colleague, a sharp young attorney named Sarah Chen who specialized in family law, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson's position is straightforward. She seeks equitable distribution of marital assets and recognition of her contributions to this marriage, contributions that extend far beyond what opposing counsel has characterized as domestic duties." Sarah's statement was brief, almost perfunctory. They'd agreed on this strategy: don't oversell, don't telegraph. Let the letter do the work. Judge Patterson nodded and reached for the folders before him. First, Charles's submission, that impressive 3-inch binder with color-coded tabs and printed exhibits showing Charles's income, his assets, his carefully constructed narrative of sole ownership. The judge flipped through it with mechanical efficiency, his expression growing slightly more weary with each page. Another divorce. Another contested asset division. Another day of watching families tear themselves apart over money. Then he reached Florence's folder. Thin. Almost apologetically sparse. 2 pages of basic marriage history. A modest financial statement showing virtually no separate assets. And tucked in the back sleeve, that cream-colored envelope. Judge Patterson's fingers paused on it. His eyebrows drew together slightly, curiosity, perhaps, or confusion at this unusual submission. He glanced up at Florence. "Mrs. Henderson, is this the letter you wanted me to review?" The courtroom went still. Even the court reporter's fingers paused above her machine. Florence met the judge's eyes with perfect calm. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe you'll find it relevant to the proceedings." Across the aisle, Charles shifted slightly. Bronson looked unconcerned, probably assuming it was an emotional plea, a desperate wife's last attempt to appeal to judicial sympathy. Judge Patterson slid his letter opener beneath the seal. The sound of tearing paper seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet courtroom. He unfolded several pages, Florence's neat handwriting filling both sides of each sheet. Began to read. His expression shifted almost immediately. The bored weariness evaporated, replaced by sharp attention. His eyebrows rose. He paused, went back to the beginning, started reading more carefully. His lips pressed together. Then, impossibly, they twitched upward. A sound escaped him. Low. Quickly stifled. A chuckle. Bronson frowned. Charles's confident posture wavered slightly. Melissa's smile became uncertain. Judge Patterson continued reading, his finger tracing down the page. Another laugh broke through, this one louder, genuine. He removed his glasses, wiped his eyes, settled them back on his nose, and kept reading. Within 30 seconds, he was laughing openly. Deep, full laughter that made his shoulders shake and echoed off the wood-paneled walls. The courtroom froze. Charles's face had gone pale. His hand, still clasped in Melissa's, had gone rigid. Eleanor leaned forward from the front row, her expression cracking from smug to confused. Your Honor. Bronson stood, his voice carrying an edge of alarm. I must object to. Judge Patterson held up one hand, still reading, still occasionally laughing with what sounded like genuine delight mixed with disbelief. Sit down, Mr. Bronson. Trust me, you'll want to hear this. He turned a page. Shook his head. Made a note in the margin. When he finally looked up, his expression had transformed completely, from bored jurist to someone who just witnessed something remarkable. His eyes found Charles first. Mr. Henderson, Judge Patterson said, his voice carrying an edge that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Are you aware that your offshore accounts are currently under investigation? The words landed like a grenade. Charles went white. Actually, physically white, the color draining from his face so quickly that Florence wondered if he might faint. What? Your Honor, I don't. What accounts? Don't. The judge's voice cut through Charles's stammering like a blade. Don't insult my intelligence by playing ignorant. Your wife's letter reads like a forensic accountant's masterpiece. He consulted the pages again. Let's see, accounts numbered 4472 to 8891 and 4472 to 8903 in the Cayman Islands. Another 3 in Bermuda. Shall I continue? Melissa's hand slipped from Charles's arm as if she'd been burned. Charles? What is he talking about? Eleanor's voice came from the front row, thin and uncertain. What's happening? Judge Patterson wasn't finished. He flipped to another page, his earlier amusement hardening into professional fury. It seems you've been quite busy, Mr. Henderson. Shell corporations, he counted quickly, 6 of them. Falsified tax documents. Client funds redirected through companies registered in. He paused, looked directly at Melissa. In Ms. Grant's name. How interesting. Melissa pushed her chair back, creating distance. I don't know anything about. There are bank statements here, the judge continued, methodical now, building a case in real time. Transfer dates. Wire receipts. And my personal favorite, forged signatures. Quite a few of them, apparently, using Mrs. Henderson's identity without her knowledge or consent. Bronson was on his feet. Your Honor, these are serious allegations that require proper investigation before. Oh, they'll get proper investigation, Mr. Bronson. Judge Patterson's tone could have frozen water. In fact, I suspect federal investigators will be very interested in this documentation. He held up the letter. Mrs. Henderson has been remarkably thorough. Account numbers. Dates. Amounts. Names of clients whose funds appear to have been redirected. He flipped to another page. She's even included transcripts of recorded phone conversations. This one's particularly illuminating, Mr. Henderson discussing with Ms. Grant how to hide assets before filing for divorce. And another featuring Mr. Henderson's mother advising him to keep her confused and compliant. Eleanor made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. But the crown jewel, Judge Patterson said, and now there was dark amusement in his voice again, is the lake house. Mrs. Henderson has documentation showing the property was purchased in her name 20 years ago as a retirement gift. Then, 6 months ago, transferred out of her name via a notarized quitclaim deed. He looked at Charles. Except Mrs. Henderson never signed that deed, did she? Charles couldn't form words. She's included a handwriting analysis, the judge continued. The signature is close, I'll give you that. But the pressure patterns are wrong. The loop formations don't match. Someone forged her signature, transferred her property, and gave it to his mistress. He set down the letter. That's fraud, Mr. Henderson. Multiple counts, actually. The courtroom had gone deathly silent except for Eleanor's ragged breathing and Melissa's nervous shifting in her chair. Bronson tried again. Your Honor, I request an immediate recess so my client can consult with. Granted. Judge Patterson nodded to the bailiff. But before we adjourn, I'm making a phone call to the district attorney's office. His eyes found Charles again, and there was no mercy in them. "They're going to be very interested in this letter. Very interested in these accounts. And very interested in how you've been managing, or should I say mismanaging, your client's funds." The bailiff stepped forward. Another officer appeared from the side door. David must have arranged that, Florence realized. Everything clicking into place like a perfectly planned lesson. Charles turned to look at Florence, and for the first time in 40 years, she saw something she'd never seen in his eyes. Real fear. Not fear of losing the divorce. Not fear of losing money. Fear of losing everything. Melissa was already moving toward the exit, her expensive heels clicking frantically on the tile floor. Eleanor sat frozen, her perfect composure shattered like porcelain. Florence remained perfectly still. Her hands folded. Her breathing even. She wasn't gloating. Wasn't celebrating. She was simply free. Free from the weight of being told she wasn't smart enough. Wasn't capable. Wasn't worth the trouble of honesty. Judge Patterson gathered the letter carefully, treating it like the evidence it was. "Mrs. Henderson," he said quietly, and there was respect in his voice, "in 30 years on this bench, I've seen many people seek revenge. But I've rarely seen anyone seek justice quite this elegantly." Florence met his eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor. I prefer to think of it as a final exam. And after 40 years of study, I made sure to get every answer right." A ghost of a smile crossed the judge's face. "Full marks, Mrs. Henderson. Full marks." As the courtroom emptied into chaos, Bronson urgently whispering with Charles, officers approaching for informal conversation, Eleanor fleeing through the back exit, Florence gathered her portfolio with steady hands. David appeared at her side, his expression carefully neutral. "You okay?" "I'm fine." And she was. Surprisingly, genuinely fine. She glanced back once at Charles, who stood with his lawyer, the confidence drained from his posture like water from a broken vessel. For 40 years, he made the rules, Florence thought, slipping her portfolio under her arm. He decided what I could know, what I could ask, what I was worth. He built my cage with compliments and condescension, with "I'm protecting you," and "you wouldn't understand." Today, I wrote the final chapter. And he understood, at last, exactly what he'd lost. Not his money. Not his assets. His assumption of superiority. And that, Florence knew as she walked out of courtroom 7B into the September sunlight, was worth more than any settlement could ever be. 6 weeks after the hearing. The seaside cottage wasn't much to look at from the outside, a small Cape Cod-style house with weathered shingles and a front porch that tilted slightly to the left. The real estate agent had apologized for its modest presentation, clearly assuming Florence would want something grander with her settlement. But Florence had fallen in love with it the moment she'd seen the view from the kitchen window, unobstructed ocean, stretching to the horizon in shades of gray and blue that changed with every passing hour. It was small. It was hers. And no one could take it away. She'd signed the papers with her maiden name, Florence Marie Miller, reclaiming the identity she'd surrendered 40 years ago. The cottage cost less than half of what she'd received in the initial settlement, leaving her with enough to live comfortably, simply, and most importantly, independently. The pension Charles had consolidated into his holdings had been returned in full, plus interest, once the federal investigation began unraveling his schemes. The lake house, her lake house, was still tied up in litigation, but Florence had already decided she'd sell it if it ever came back to her. Too many ghosts lived in those walls now. This cottage, though. This was a beginning. She'd spent the past 3 weeks decorating it with careful intention. No designer. No expensive furniture meant to impress. Just pieces she actually liked, a worn leather reading chair from an estate sale, bookshelves built by a local carpenter, a kitchen table small enough for one but expandable for guests. The bedroom faced east, catching the sunrise. She'd hung sheer white curtains that filtered the morning light into something soft and forgiving. Her mother's pearls rested in a jewelry box on the dresser, not put away, but not worn daily either. A reminder of where she'd come from, but not a chain binding her to the past. Florence had discovered something surprising in these weeks of solitude. She liked her own company. 40 years of being told she needed someone to manage her life, to make decisions for her, to protect her from her own inadequacy. And here she was, balancing her own checkbook, managing her own investments, making her own choices. And she was fine. Better than fine. David Ruiz visited on a Friday afternoon in early October, carrying a bottle of wine and the slightly uncertain expression of a former student entering his teacher's space. "Mrs. Henderson," he started, then caught himself at her raised eyebrow. "Florence. Sorry. Old habits. Come in, David." She led him through the cottage to the back porch, where 2 Adirondack chairs faced the ocean. "I hope you don't mind sitting outside. The view is too good to waste." "It's beautiful." He settled into one of the chairs, setting the wine bottle on the small table between them. "How are you settling in?" "Surprisingly well." Florence smiled. "I've discovered I'm quite good at being alone. Turns out it's not loneliness when it's your choice." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the waves roll in with rhythmic persistence. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the sound of surf. "I have updates," David said finally. "If you want to hear them." Florence considered. Did she want to know? Did it matter anymore what happened to Charles, to Melissa, to the elaborate structure of lies that had finally collapsed? Yes. She decided. Not for revenge, that chapter was closed. But for closure. For the satisfaction of knowing that truth had consequences. "Tell me." David pulled out a folder. He always came prepared, just like when he'd been her student. Charles's accounts were frozen 2 days after the hearing. All of them, domestic, offshore, everything. The firm collapsed within a week once clients started demanding audits of their portfolios. How many were affected? 43 clients. Total losses estimated at just over $6 million. David's voice was professionally neutral, but Florence heard the undercurrent of anger. Some of them were retirees who trusted him with everything they had. Florence closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of that betrayal. Not just her betrayal, everyone's. Are they being compensated? The federal recovery process is ongoing. They'll get most of it back, but it'll take time. Your documentation helped tremendously. Investigators said it cut months off their timeline. Maybe years. Good. It wasn't enough. Money recovered couldn't undo the anxiety, the sleepless nights, the shattered trust, but it was something. Charles has been indicted on 14 counts, David continued. Wire fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, tax evasion. His attorney is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA's office isn't interested. They want to make an example. And Melissa? Disappeared the day after the hearing. Emptied her apartment, closed her bank accounts, left town. Last anyone heard, she was in Arizona using her mother's maiden name. David paused. The diamond bracelet Charles gave her? Purchased with funds from Patricia Brennan's estate account. Mrs. Brennan is 83 years old. That bracelet represented about a third of her late husband's life insurance. Florence felt a cold anger settle in her chest. Will Melissa face charges? They're building a case. She wasn't an innocent bystander, she was complicit in setting up the shell companies, signing documents, facilitating transfers. It's just a matter of time. And Eleanor? David's expression shifted to something close to satisfaction. Eleanor Henderson is facing potential charges as an accessory. She knew about the schemes, advised Charles on hiding assets, and actively participated in defrauding you specifically. Her attorney is arguing she's too elderly for prosecution, but given her recorded statements. He shrugged. The DA thinks otherwise. Florence imagined Eleanor, that woman who'd spent 40 years delivering casual cruelty disguised as helpful advice, now facing consequences for the first time in her privileged life. There's one more thing, David said, and now he was smiling. Judge Patterson's reaction in court? It's become legendary at the courthouse. Staff have been calling it the letter that made Patterson laugh. Apparently, judges are now referring difficult pro se litigants to family law resources and saying, write it like Mrs. Henderson wrote hers. Florence laughed, genuine, surprised laughter. I've become a case study? You've become an inspiration. David's voice was warm. A woman who spent 40 years being told she couldn't understand finances just took down a white-collar criminal using nothing but patience and precision. That's a pretty good story. It's a true story, Florence corrected gently. Which makes it better. After David left, Florence sat alone on the porch watching the sun descend toward the horizon. The October air had turned cool, carrying the salt-sharp smell of the ocean and the first hints of autumn. She pulled out her leather journal, for the record, now nearly full. The last pages contained notes from the hearing, copies of the judge's orders, updates on the investigation's progress. Florence turned to a fresh page and uncapped her pen. October 15th. I didn't want his money. I wanted the truth to cost him everything. And it did. Not because I was cruel or vindictive, but because I was thorough. Because I paid attention when everyone assumed I wasn't capable of understanding. Because I documented what I observed and trusted that facts, properly presented, would speak for themselves. Charles spent 40 years teaching me that I was small, incompetent, unworthy of trust or respect. He built an elaborate structure of control designed to keep me dependent and grateful. What he didn't realize was that structures built on lies eventually collapse under their own weight. And that the woman he underestimated was actually paying very close attention. I've learned something these past months. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that people face consequences for their choices, their cruelty, their crimes. Charles will face his consequences. Melissa will face hers. Even Eleanor, finally, will understand that cruelty has a price. And me? I'm free. She closed the journal and set it aside. As twilight settled over the water, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Florence walked down to the beach. The sand was cool beneath her bare feet, still damp from the receding tide. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out the wedding ring she'd removed 6 weeks ago. The one with Charles's grandmother's diamond. The one that had symbolized promises that turned out to be lies. Florence held it up to the fading light, watching it catch the last rays of sun. 40 years of marriage reduced to a small circle of gold and stone. For a moment, she considered keeping it. Selling it. Donating it. Using it somehow. Then she drew her arm back and threw it as hard as she could into the waves. It arced through the air, a brief flash of light, then disappeared into the gray-blue water without a sound. The ocean swallowed it completely, as if it had never existed. Florence stood at the waterline, letting the waves wash over her feet, and whispered into the salt air. You said I'd never touch your money again, Charles. You were right. The wind carried her words out over the water. But I touched something far more valuable. I touched the truth. And I used it to show the world exactly who you were beneath all that charm and arrogance. A wave broke higher, soaking the hem of her dress. She didn't step back. You thought you'd erased me. Thought you'd reduce me to nothing more than a footnote in your success story. A dependent wife. A burden to be eliminated. The horizon was darkening now, the sun nearly gone. But I wasn't erased. I was just waiting. Watching. Learning. Florence smiled, not bitter, not angry. Peaceful. Now I own something you can never take away. My peace. My freedom. My certainty that I am enough, exactly as I am. She turned away from the water, walking back toward her cottage where warm lights glowed in the windows. And that, she whispered, is worth more than every dollar you ever hid, every lie you ever told, every year I spent believing I was less than I was. 1 year later. Florence Miller, she'd legally changed her name back, shedding the Henderson identity like an old coat that no longer fit, stood in front of a classroom for the first time in 5 years. Not as a principal. Not even as a full-time teacher. As a guest lecturer at the community college, teaching a course she'd designed herself, financial literacy for women over 50, taking control of your economic life. 23 women filled the room. Divorcees. Widows. Women who'd spent decades letting someone else manage the money, make the decisions, control the narrative. Women who were ready to learn. Financial literacy isn't about being good at math, Florence told them on that first day, her voice carrying the same clear authority it had held in countless classrooms over the years. It's about understanding that knowledge is power. That questions aren't signs of incompetence, they're signs of intelligence. That no one who truly respects you will ever make you feel stupid for wanting to understand. She told them her story, not all of it, but enough. The woman who trusted. The man who betrayed. The patient collection of evidence. The letter that changed everything. I was told for 40 years that I couldn't understand finances, Florence said. That I was too soft-hearted, too scatterbrained, too female to grasp the complexities of money. She smiled at the roomful of women who nodded in recognition. I learned that the people who tell you that you can't understand something usually have a vested interest in keeping you confused. And the best revenge isn't anger, it's competence. After class, several women stayed to talk. To ask questions. To share their own stories of financial control and economic abuse. One woman, 72 years old, recently widowed, terrified of her own bank statements, gripped Florence's hand and said, "I thought I was too old to learn this. Too old to start over." Florence squeezed back. "I was 67 when I started over. And I learned that age isn't a limitation, it's an accumulation. Of experience. Of wisdom. Of patience." She thought of Charles, currently serving the second year of a 15-year sentence at a federal correctional facility. Of Melissa, facing her own indictment after being extradited from Arizona. Of Eleanor, whose assets had been frozen pending civil suits from defrauded clients. Justice hadn't been swift. But it had been certain. "We're never too old to reclaim ourselves," Florence said. "Sometimes it just takes longer to realize we need to." That evening, Florence returned to her cottage as the sun set over the ocean. She made herself dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta with vegetables from the garden she'd planted in the spring, and ate on the back porch while the sky turned from gold to purple to star-scattered black. Her phone buzzed. A text from David, "Saw your first class was today. How'd it go?" Florence smiled and typed back, 23 students. 23 women ready to learn they're capable of anything. "You're doing good work," he replied. "Mrs. H would be proud." "Mrs. H is proud," she wrote back. "She just goes by Ms. Miller now." She set down her phone and looked out at the water. Somewhere beneath those waves lay a wedding ring that had once symbolized everything she thought she wanted. What she had now was better. A cottage that was hers. A bank account she controlled. A future she was building one deliberate choice at a time. And the quiet, unshakable certainty that she'd reclaimed not just her finances, but herself. Florence Miller, teacher, survivor, architect of her own second act, smiled into the darkness and whispered one last time. "Thank you, Charles. For underestimating me so completely that when I finally stood up, you never saw it coming." The ocean answered with the steady rhythm of waves. And Florence, at last, was home.